Welcome to Sound Sagas. We're back with another guest episode featuring Jenna Chapman, DJ, polymath, super cool person.
I try.
And Andrew's here too.
Hey guys, I'm here too.
Just an accessory. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
We actually all know each other.
Yeah, I don't mean to belittle
So
you.
it's kind of weird to introduce each other, right? It's like kind of like knowing each other for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Jenna DJs, of course, is on the radio, and we actually went to school together.
Yes, the deepest of cuts. Yeah.
So like it goes back.
Yeah.
But obviously a lover of music, like deep down. You wouldn't operate in all these spaces like DJing and stuff if you didn't love music.
It's true. Yeah. All the pragmaticism of your youth comes back at you, and maybe it's not your day job, but you find ways to integrate it into your life, and music has truly been a part of my entire life.
Nice.
Yeah. And I mean, for all of us, but today, what do you want to talk about with us?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would love to talk about, it seems silly to say out loud, I love jazz, and I want to talk about a pattern I've been noticing in local jazz and jazz worldwide, frankly, but there's a cool thing happening, and I don't know what to call it, so I would love to talk to you about it and see if we can come up with some ideas or something. But I can also just talk a little bit about my experience with jazz in the Chicago area being kind of a crucible for jazz music throughout history, but especially now, and how I came to be someone who consumes a large variety and quantity of jazz in various formats. So
Cool. And just to clarify, do you mean like we're coming up with a genre name, kind of like the shoegaze pitchfork phenomenon?
It's something I've been thinking about because I've done some digging on articles to see if there's already a name for this phenomenon that I've been noticing, and I haven't found one yet that's really called it out. There's been things that, not to get too ahead of ourselves here, but there are influences of bringing hip hop back into jazz. There's Afrofuturist elements, and they all call out the elements, but there's not a name for the movement or anything that I've seen. I don't think anyone's gone so far as to call it a movement. And I struggle with that a little bit because I see a very clear, defined pattern and category here without a name.
Mm-hmm.
So if y'all are thinking of stuff while we're talking, or if y'all are listening and come up with some cool ideas, let us know, because I would love to have a label to slap on this other than, like a specific record label. But
I like that. It's like a cool, achievable, definable goal.
Right? Yeah.
Amidst the conversation, but also get in the comments.
And it's something I've been thinking about for a while, and I can't quite put my finger on it, so maybe articulating it in this conversation will help.
I think in a prior episode you had mentioned to me, like when I had started defining sort of category-based shapes around sounds and heavy music, like heavy metal, you were like, well, that's very music journalist of you.
Yeah.
There is an element of that to that way of thinking, but like broader stroke, I think what you're saying too is like, you sense like something different sounding coming out, and there's like not really a way to like quickly articulate what that is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, this is the perfect format for
perfect. Yeah, let's
get
into
it.
Explore.
Tell me more. Yes.
Great. Well, where do we want to start?
At the beginning.
At the beginning? Okay. When I was a wee lass back in the day. No, actually, though, I guess it would probably help to talk a little bit about my personal experience with this and then get into it from there. So I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, which is, pretty homogenous, as it were. But we were always on the Metro train line from Chicago. And my parents, we were a family that grew up with the radio on in the house all the time. WDCB is the local jazz station in Chicago. It was always on at my house.
Shout out.
And honestly, great station. It's an absolute legacy. And my folks were always really good at integrating their children into adult activities, one of which is sitting down and shutting up during a jazz concert. And they actually found, we go to Ravinia and stuff like that, but they found a couple of clubs in Chicago that actually would permit kids.
Right.
And one of those, this is a deep cut, but it was blues and jazz. And Blues Chicago, like it's BLUES, like the abbreviation. It's a tourist trap kind of blues club near downtown.
I'm not familiar, but yeah.
Yeah, so they had this big kind of tourist trappy club, but it was a good blues club. They had a store. It was just called Blue Chicago Store, but in the basement they would do all ages shows, and it was all the same big names that would come through for literally a dozen people in folding metal chairs.
Interesting.
I remember being 12 and going down to the basement of this place on like Erie or something.
Nice.
And there was a harp battle. Like 2 harmonica players brought out a suitcase full of harmonicas and they did like a full blues set with dueling harmonicas, and it was crazy.
That's dope that your parents did that. Like, exposed you to that. I have a similar, like, growing up, my parents took me out to this French Creole restaurant that always had live jazz.
Nice.
It was more of like that, like more upscale kind of feely kind of environment.
Bistro-esque.
But then they would after dinner, they'd take me out to this bar and my mom would talk to the bouncer and be like,
Yeah,
somehow I'm 15 and I can drink a Diet Coke or a Coke at the bar and sit and like no one says anything and they have live music, like a 4-piece or a 5-piece jazz band.
Yeah.
And like, I gotta tell you, that got me into other music. Like,
I'm saying, bringing kids to live music is so important. And I did piano lessons when I was really little. And then when, that time comes in elementary school where they're like, pick an instrument. And I don't know if they did that for y'all, but it was like 5th grade, 6th grade for us.
Came a little later for me. But
yeah. So we had a younger music program, and they only let people who had piano experience do percussion. Mm-hmm. And so I was the only girl who wanted to do percussion. So I was like, yeah, I'm going to be a drummer. And then go into these jazz shows with my folks and like seeing the drummers and how intense all of that was. And the drum solos in jazz sets are wild. They're just off the chain all the time.
It's all the solos.
Yeah.
It's like part of the reason why I gravitated so quickly to heavy metal from jazz is not necessarily like the aesthetic carryovers, but like the flipping solos, man.
Oh yeah, the improvisational element,
exactly.
totally. And being able to come up with that off the cuff is still something I do not have a handle on. I took drum set lessons for 3 years and never got it. Anyway, digression.
Yeah.
Grew up listening to a lot of jazz and knowing who these artists were, because my dad has always been a huge music person. I very much get that from him, and he would always talk to me about who we were listening to.
Gotcha.
And we'd be listening to Led Zeppelin and he'd be like, all right, now you have to memorize it's John Paul Jones and Robert Plant and John Bonham, so he
just understanding the names, concepts,
just drilling all that. And so we would go to these clubs, and then as I got older, I had a really tight-knit group of friends, probably my junior, senior year of high school, who were all deeply embedded in the music program. So I was in 2 school choirs and 2 church choirs and a band and did my study hall in the music department office and, was like very in that land. And for whatever reason, the kids that were 2 grades younger than me were deeply also embedded in music, and so I ended up befriending a couple of them, one of whom is an old friend of mine who now performs different kinds of music in the city. So if you ever heard DPCD, Alec Watson, amazing artist, also keyboardist for the band Iverson, if you've ever heard of them, but he used to be big into jazz.
Okay.
And so he got together with some other kids in the jazz program, went to there's like a jazz incubator for high school kids in the city, like did all this stuff, ended up going to a program out in Stockton, California, that's like a college for jazz people at one point, super, super deep on it. And they played Taste of Chicago on one of the opening stages, just doing all jazz stuff. And that got me going to a lot more jazz shows when I was in my teen years, because I would go to his shows and be like, this is so cool. And he would like play all this different stuff. And I just started hearing the pieces and recognizing what they were. It just very much followed me from childhood through adulthood to know what these reference points were. And I don't think I've ever stopped listening to jazz. There's probably been a point in time at which I wasn't consuming the new stuff as much. And honestly, a lot of new jazz before, and I don't want to draw any hard lines in the sand here, but a lot of what people see as contemporary jazz is reiterations of traditional jazz, like calling back to hard bop, calling back to Coltrane, like Davis, all the greats. they're not necessarily changing the format. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And a lot of the stuff I feel like I heard that was still new growing up was just reiterations of traditional format jazz, which is not a bad thing. Seeing that live is fantastic.
Yeah,
but
Well, I think that holds true to just how people practice and perform music too.
Well, yeah, no one shits on Stoner Doom for sounding like Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it is like Black Sabbath, just heavier and newer. But people love it. Like, it's so popular. So,
right. Yeah. Like, you find a format, you stick with it, and I get it. But what has captured my attention, what I want to bring to this conversation is, I want to say 21st century for sure, probably late 2000s, early 2010s is when I've really noticed this stuff starting to come through. But like the format is changing, and that's what's really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, to circle back a little bit, like, huge proponent of all ages shows. I mean,
yes,
I don't know if you would have gotten there without all that. Like, I was always amazed and like impressed when I could go to a show when I was under 18.
Yeah.
Like, it was a harder thing to do than it should be.
Yeah. And it still is. I mean,
Have a Nice Life show at House of Blues recently was all ages.
Well, that's good.
Kids in the crowd.
I see way more of it than when I was in high school.
Yeah. And it tends to be more prominent in the suburbs, obviously, just because you expect more families and stuff. But yeah, even
big venues just don't usually have an interest in it. It seems like
right,
which has always been an
and
issue.
in the city, small clubs. It's like you were saying. I could get in with my parents sometimes.
Right. I wonder how much you can do that now. This would have been back in the 90s.
Yeah.
2000.
We're old now.
Early 2000s. But yeah, depending on who you know, and you can get your 16-year-old if he sits in this corner and is quiet or something, But access at a young age is so critical. So anytime people kind of poo-poo all ages shows, I'm always like, I get you, but really understand like it's important for kids to see music.
Yeah, and you have all this context now for why you're like, oh, this is different than all this other stuff I got to see.
Yeah. And I'll say specifically for jazz in the city, Jazz Showcase is a great one about allowing all ages shows. They're in the South Loop.
Cool.
That was one we got to go to when I was younger, and they have a Sunday matinee at 4. So if it's like, if you ever want to go see jazz and you're like, I don't want to be out till 10 p.m.
Yep.
They're a great one for that. They do have a bar, so adults don't worry. But
shout out.
Yeah, it is. It's a great space, and I often see kids in there, and it's really cool to see them enjoying jazz.
How would you describe what's the quick synopsis, I guess, on the format change you were talking about? Like,
yeah, absolutely. So, kind of the thesis statement in my mind is a reincorporation. So jazz is the OG, right? I mean, blues is really the OG, but jazz is kind of, for a lot of American music, a format that launched many, many others. And so what I'm seeing is a reincorporation of subsequent music styles like hip hop, funk, R&B, probably the biggest ones, a little Motown maybe, but really more the kind that have like long jam capability.
But you wouldn't call it a fusion. You would call it more of like a
segment, so think about it as this is the next generation, right?
Yeah.
This is folks who on the oldest are maybe 10 years older than us, like 40s. Like, I haven't seen anybody over 50 doing this kind of music necessarily. People who grew up listening to hip hop, people who grew up jamming to, Earth, Wind, and Fire and Parliament Funkadelic and all that stuff on the older side, and maybe that was their parents' music. But definitely 80s, 90s hip hop and bringing that aesthetic back to jazz. That is with a little outside curve of some just free improvisational classical and return to deeply roots elements like gospel and traditional music.
Is this like post jazz?
It might be post jazz, honestly.
If I type that, I hesitate to type that into Google,
post
but I really want to.
Pisses me off. I'm not gonna lie.
It's broad. We'll get it.
Yeah, we can winnow it down, but
that's a good starting point.
But I think the biggest influence is hip hop for sure, and I think that is kind of encapsulated in the artist who I see as a focal point for a lot of this innovation, Micaiah McCraven, Chicago drummer. Drummer is reductive. he actually refers to himself as a beat scientist. And while that might sound pretentious in any other context, in the context of the music he's doing, it absolutely makes sense because he's rearranging traditional jazz elements with a very percussion heavy focus and bringing in jazz. When you think of traditional jazz, has a very specific beat pattern, right? It's like there's like a bunch of different ones, but they're all very swung or they're very like linear, right? This is triples, this is time signature changes, this is the overlay of time structures that hip hop has a lot of time, where you have a big driving down beat, but then you have the like
is he
a
doing
bunch
like
of
polyrhythmic stuff even?
There's some polyrhythmic stuff for sure.
So it's like really like scientifically
he is honing in on exactly what beat he wants, and sometimes even just the juxtaposition of traditional jazz elements with a more 2/4 heavy hip hop beat as opposed to a swung jazz beat flips the script sonically on what's happening.
Yeah.
And this is the main element you were talking about where it's a format change.
Yeah,
right?
it really feels like
Comes
that.
So
you have percussion is kind of the foundation of this. There's also an element of a lyricism in the melody part of it. So I feel like trad jazz is you have a hook that is repeated and then you have an improvisational piece. There's a lot more through composition in this stuff. So you're seeing melodies and motifs that are drawn out through an entire piece rather than, here's this little riff, here's a break for improv, here's the little riff again, not to say there isn't improvisation. There's a ton of improvisation, but there's a sort of ambient or atmospheric quality to these melodies. There's a lot more harmonies. There's a lot more layer. And if you took the beat away, it would almost be sonically slow or actual ambient. Yeah. I'm hating it the more you say it, but it's also so true.
We started with this, with the question, what do we call this?
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
that
atmosphere element
right.
is the nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
Honestly,
Well, maybe we'll like think on it, do a top 5 at the end.
But having not heard any of this, or at least not knowing that I've heard any of this, this all sounds very, very like compelling.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say there are elements of this in more accessible music. So I'm talking about Micaiah, a sort of related piece that is much probably more prominent would be the work that Kamasi Washington has done, if you're familiar with him. The LA scene of whatever this movement is, whatever this type of music is much more in direct contact with hip hop music. So like Kamasi has worked with Kendrick Lamar, with Terrace Martin. There's a lot more immediate crossover.
Right.
And in that music, you see a lot more accessible pop forward elements that honestly, I had this thought once and I can't get out of my head and it might sound dumb, but I see a lot of callbacks to like Burt Bacharach and that level of like orchestral, melodic, cinematic
I don't
composition.
think it's dumb. He has influenced a lot of
That's not dumb at all.
stuff.
That's that makes me, I'm having to conceptualize that. That's really interesting.
But so that is like very much the pop side of the coin.
Right.
And that's not meant to be derogatory at all. It's like if you want a 101 entry level to what jazz has changed into being, Kamasi is a great access point for that because he's incorporating the Afrofuturist elements. He's incorporating the cinematic, melodic scale of everything, the through composition, but he's also more immediately calling back to the hip hop stuff, and he's doing it in a way that someone who is not a jazz consumer can listen to and enjoy immediately rather than having to learn the jazz vocabulary, which I feel like as much as my main focus here is the Micaiah, the international anthem, which I'll get into in a little bit, the London scene of this, Shabaka Hutchings, Sons of Kemet, Comet is Coming. That music is maybe not as accessible to someone who doesn't necessarily have the same background with jazz and consuming that music because it's just like it's harder to find, and you've
maybe a bit more esoteric.
Maybe a little more esoteric. I mean, you said you listen to some Sons of Kemet,
I have listened to
right?
Sons of Kemet, and now that we talk, and like this fits the bill.
Yeah. So how did you find Sons of Kemet when you were first listening to it? As someone who maybe doesn't consume as much jazz.
One of the people who have given me 2 of my favorite recommendations of albums in a long time, for a while. This is back in the day when I was doing music journalism. Was the ex head editor of the website that I became head editor of. So one of the people before me. And he just recommended me Sons of Kemet. Like, hey, check this. He gave me no context. He said, I think you might like this.
Okay.
And I immediately was drawn to, obviously, like the jazzy elements of it that I kind of grew up with listening to jazz, and that was being like my first live music experience was always jazz.
Yeah.
And like I immediately hooked onto it because of that, but also because, like you said, it has an expressive, like, overarching motif to it. It has a more atmospheric quality, and it has different beats and melodies than I'm used to in what you call trad jazz. So I immediately thought it was like, this is cutting edge. Like, this is cool. This sounds new. This is interesting, and it's not jazz.
Right. Thank you.
I'm like, but it is in a way.
It is jazz, but
yeah,
cutting edge was my first thought too. It feels so different that it needs to be something else.
I think it does, yeah.
And I really hope it's not post jazz, but it might be.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's an easy way to sell it or to say it, but it's when you say post anything, you're bringing in a lot of connotation to that. You're bringing in a lot of like, what do I think? So I think generally you should hesitate away from the post prefix.
I mean, as we've learned from post punk.
Yeah. I mean, but it is
post rock.
Yeah. These things are things, and like post metal and post black metal, these things exist, even subcategories down. But in general, I think when we want to explore it more deeply, we would steer away from post and try to be more specific about what we mean.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what we're doing. But yeah, Sons of Kemet, we'll put links for everything you mentioned. Yeah. Sons of Kemet, that definitely, like, and we talked about this with Chris, but movement, like music of movement. Like, not to say that jazz or trad jazz inherently doesn't have any body movement.
Oh, it absolutely does.
Tons.
Yeah.
But this maybe gains, but definitely doesn't lose any of that.
I think there's a more where maybe the previous generations of jazz had to be. Actually, that's not entirely true. I mean, you think about Alice Coltrane. You think about Miles Davis. Miles Davis was never shy about what his stances were. And John Coltrane definitely had some huge spiritual, and I'm just calling out big names, but like all the guys from especially like the 60s, hard bop kind of post movements there. There were absolutely social movements involved in their music, but whether it's because these artists in this iteration have more incorporation of vocals, maybe there's a more explicit incorporation of gospel themes or themes that are more obviously in some sort of transcendentalist space.
Yeah.
It really does feel like the Black Power, the Afrofuturism, and in London, there's a specific aligning with the culture of the West Indies as well in that music, but it all feels very much more intentional and explicit this time around. And
Gotcha.
You can there are artists in this space that is the ethos of their work.
Yes,
so
yes.
if you look at Angel Bataweed, who is on the International Anthem record label, and I'll say International Anthem is a great starting point for this kind of music. They're a Chicago-based label. They're covering a ton of artists we've talked about, Micaiah McCraven, all the people in Micaiah McCraven's band, Junius Paul, Marquise Hill, all those guys, Desron Douglas, Brandy Younger, who's a harpist. And that's another thing, is the incorporation of not traditionally jazz instruments into this. So harp, cello, all sorts of different stuff. But Angel Bataweed, her whole thing is all of her music comes from a place of empowering Black boys and calling to that experience, that pain, whatever it might be. And it's achingly beautiful because of that. Obviously, not the best person to speak on all of the experiences incorporated in that, but we can definitely post some links in the website and the blog post for writers who can speak to that a bit more.
Absolutely.
But Angel has Actually, let me pull up the name. It's the Great Black Music course, I believe. Yeah. She does a Great Black Music course at Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center through Old Town School of Folk. And she's looking to start her own music school. And all of her music is rooted in speaking to that experience. Yeah. And her music verges between that kind of truly free, transcendental of genre type of music and having jazz elements, having classical elements. She's a clarinetist, she's a singer, she's a pianist. Actually, as a sidebar, one of the best jazz shows I've ever been to in the city, I took my parents to Elastic Arts Center, which is a second-story random loft conversion space in Logan Square that does jazz and contemporary music.
Yeah, a lot of experimental music, too.
A lot of experimental music. I took my parents to see Angel Bataweed there, and my mom and I ended up dancing in the aisle, and Angel was, like, running around the whole space playing clarinet and just, like, throwing her hands up, and she came and hugged us, and she's, like, wearing full paint and, like, garb and everything, and it was, honestly felt amazingly spiritual. It was a beautiful musical experience.
That's awesome.
I feel like Chicago, best city
yeah.
in the world to get some of that, you know?
I mean, I was going to say, actually, like, all of this seems very, like, happening right now in this moment, progressive, wild, but in, like, a cool artistic sense.
Absolutely.
And it's bizarre to me, but also cool that it's happening, like, right down the block. You know, like, Elastic Arts is in my neighborhood.
Right.
Like, all these shows that are happening, like, this is all stuff happening right here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that's probably a great space to talk about where all of this is happening and who's involved, because I know I've dropped a bunch of names and we're like, who are all these people? So really the crucibles of this, in my mind, are Chicago and London.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the bands we talked about, Sons of Kemet, Shabaka, that's all London. Micaiah, Angel, International Anthem is all Chicago. Right. And we can really kind of break it down into where's this happening and why and who is involved, and then the pieces all kind of string together.
It's cool that you mentioned that the more activist side of it, like the more social messaging side of it is part inherently almost. I think of what you're saying is like it's part of the music itself.
Yes.
Yeah, you could not describe this new way of music without describing that messaging or that lyricism.
Yeah, it's very much inherent. Yeah.
Tied into it.
I think that's important to say,
and taking the flavor of
and that
makes
it now. That
right.
makes it very now.
And the flavor of that in Chicago versus London is also very different because those experiences are so different. And we can talk a little bit about why that might be for each of those spaces. Really, the kind of crucibles of this scene I do see as being Chicago and London. And there's people behind that, but there's institutions behind that. So in Chicago, it's Micaiah McCraven. I won't say any of them are like the father of the local scene, but it does feel like Micaiah is the uncle that gets everyone over to his house for Thanksgiving. Okay. You know what I mean?
So like these are the first stop you would go.
Yeah. And then you would branch off from there as a person. But really, I think the reason for that is because of the record label International Anthem.
Okay.
So this is International Anthem Recording Co. It is a Chicago label that was founded in 2012. And it's Scotty McNeese and Dave Allen.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And they founded this label, I think, just to bring this kind of music together. Scotty, I think, is someone who started his career as programming music for restaurants. Like he worked for Hog Salt Hospitality.
That's so strange.
Right? Yeah. But if you think about that kind of music, the sort of acid house informed kind of jazz.
Elevated music.
Yeah. Okay. Don't bring that into this space.
I'm not trying to bring it down. But
wow.
I mean, that's...
No, but yeah. But
that mentality is where it came from.
It's you want to seem innovative, but you also want to have accessible instrumental, I
mean, as someone who listens to the SimCity 3000 Unlimited soundtrack for real.
Respect. Actually, that's solid. But so someone who has that kind of mentality approach to music, they
makes
formed,
sense.
Yeah, they formed International Anthem. And so a lot of the artists we've talked about so far, Micaiah McCraven, Angel Bataweed, Junius Paul, Desron Douglas, Brandy Younger. This is going to be like a proper noun souffle. But all of these creators that have made music in this post-jazz space or whatever we're calling it in the U.S., almost all of them have released albums on International Anthem.
Gotcha.
And this is a Chicago label.
Yes.
Not only is the music coming from Chicago in a very real sense, but a vast majority of the creators either live in or spend a lot of time in Chicago. And a good example of that would be Brandy Younger, the harpist, and Desron Douglas, who is a bassist. They're New York based originally. Brandy's from New York, but has been spending more and more time in Chicago because that is where the collaboration is. In fact, Chicago Jazz Fest this past Labor Day weekend, Micaiah McCraven had a set. Brandy Younger had a solo set, not truly solo, but a headlining set, I should say. And So she spent her whole weekend here in Chicago, and she just comes out for this stuff because this is where all the people she plays with are. And I think they made some mention in one of the concert programs that she may have actually relocated to Chicago at this point. She also plays with the band Reservoir, which also released an international anthem, and I want to save bookmark for later because they're representative of the younger generation that is coming through for this. So Micaiah, Brandy, Junius, all these folks, Angel, they're all in their 30s and 40s. There's a younger generation that's 20s and 30s that are coming through with this kind of music as well. Also, some on international anthems, some on other labels like Super Records, which I can get into.
But it's interesting it's a multi-generational.
Multi-generational, but definitely on the younger side because we're not talking people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, for example.
Well, and it's validating to say like, oh, this is something different and new because all these people are gathering here.
Right.
This label is forming,
with similar backgrounds
similar
in
interests,
their own music
and
interests,
identifying each other.
They grew up with hip hop. They grew up with, all these later iterations of music and are now bringing that back to jazz. Right. So very much a younger person's movement, I would say. And Micaiah is probably the most established of these since he moved to Chicago and really started making his name here in the late 2000s, so 2007, before International Anthem started, worth flagging. But I think he started pulling all these people into his sphere compositionally and performatively. And he's also had, I think, the most international touring experience. And that's kind of where we can leapfrog over to London and that side of the scene. Because every time Micaiah goes overseas, he's working with Shabaka Hutchings. He's also, Shabaka comes here, plays with Micaiah. They've collaborated. Micaiah has this album called Universal Beings, which is a double LP. Each side of the record is recorded live in a different place. And on the London side, Shabaka is on pretty much every track with everyone from the London scene. So the London scene is really interesting because the root of it, to me, seems to be this nonprofit program called Tomorrow's Warriors, which is a jazz education scene in London, or jazz education program in London, specifically for disadvantaged and underrepresented youth in music.
I mean, we love public funds for music and arts.
Hell yeah. And Tomorrow's Warriors alumni are kind of crazy. So this program's been going since 91. So also speaking to the younger side of things because the kinds of innovations that are coming out of there are not necessarily going to be informed by something from the 70s and 80s, right? This is a relatively newer program, although 91's, as we know, not as young as it used to be.
It's like 32 years ago. But,
Right. But in the scheme of jazz, that's like fairly recent.
And a demonstrably successful run because you mentioned alumni, right?
Exactly. Shabaka Hutchings being one of them. So,
and can we step back 1 second too and say like, who are the main players in this London scene?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say much in the way that Micaiah is very much a spoke in the wheel, or not spoke. What's the thing? The axle, the hub. The middle part.
I mean,
the axle, the hub.
Yeah, the hub in the wheel for the Chicago scene. Shabaka is that for the London scene.
Nice.
And he is, as we talked about, the leader of Sons of Kemet.
Yes.
Also, The Comet is Coming. Also very much doing his own solo stuff. Also has just collaborated with anyone and everyone.
Yeah, I was going to say
hyper
involved and hyper
collaborative, and an alumnus of this program for which he still mentors, I believe. Like, he is still involved in the program. So we have him. We have a number of other artists like... I just had that on the tip of my tongue. Well, let me talk about Nubia Garcia then first, because Nubia Garcia...
a new character has entered the room.
Yes. Well, so she's really cool because she's on the younger end of the spectrum, too. So she's in her mid-20s, I want to say. But she's also a product of this Tomorrow's Warriors program. And she actually just won the Mercury Prize, which is like the British Grammys, right? Not Mercury's the British one, right?
I am fairly certain.
Because I always mix it up with the Canadian
Correction coming if I messed up.
The Canadian one is, what the hell?
I always forget the Canadian one.
Yeah, I do too.
Because one of the artists I follow won.
There's an Australian one too that I'd never remember.
Yeah.
Stupid Americans.
But so Nubia's debut album was called Source, and it came out, I want to say 2020, and immediately won the Mercury Prize for that year. And she's a saxophone player. And it's just also awesome to talk about a solo debuting jazz artist that's that young, that's a female identifying person. Like, That's another thing I appreciate about this movement is it's much more gender and inclusive.
I guess if you were to define this movement not just based on its musicality, but of all the factors that kind of make it up, you're putting good pin marks in like
socially informed,
exactly, yeah,
expansive in who is participating in it.
Right.
Yeah, and it's just all coming from a good place. Like
Yeah.
there's no kind of bad scene or bad like influence happening here.
And one thing I've seen, I was reading some articles just trying to get into what is this, see if it had already been named, right? And one thing that came up was, hey, look at all these jazz artists. There aren't that many people in jazz education spaces that fit into marginalized groups anymore because they can't afford it. And so it was saying the like academization, is that a thing?
It should be.
Right?
It is,
yeah. The making academic of jazz has boxed out so many people who would normally be included in a jazz scene.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And to the effect of, I think the stat they actually pulled was 5% of people in college level jazz programs, like majors, not extracurricular, are identify as Black.
Right.
Like that's crazy.
Yeah.
In a scene that is entirely rooted in Black culture. Like
this is like intersectionality, like demonstrated.
Right.
This is exactly that. Yeah.
And so it's cool to see in this, again, name TBD scene that we're describing here is very much rooted in empowering those voices and not being exclusive as far as education.
Right.
And in London, very much the proactive version where we are going out of our way to educate young people to come up in this music where there may have been barriers before.
Right.
And Nubia is a perfect example of that. Her family's from the West Indies. So this is where you get some of the West Indies influence as well. You can hear it in actually the title track on her album where she brings in a really heavy level of dub into it, which is super, it's a delicious groove. I have to say that'll be on the playlist. But there's heavy dub influences. She has one that has...
it's coming out of London, for Christ's
sake. Right, yeah. I mean, you got to. And there's a cumbia track in there too. It is just, it's delicious. But so she is a great example of that program. Kamal Williams, I don't think comes from the program, but he works with all of them. He's a keyboardist and has a little bit of that dub and hip hop incorporation in there. And he's collaborated with Micaiah. Right. He's done all of that.
An interesting part of this story is the extent to which opening musical opportunities to people who generally don't have them or traditionally wouldn't have them creates different kinds of music.
Absolutely,
That's a key you can put into a slot and turn and create more art, almost in a way, or at least functionally allow it to happen.
Yeah,
and allow people to organize and then do their thing. But I think that's an extremely powerful statement. Yeah. Like to describe this post jazz, to describe it without that would be be missing something key to the story.
Yeah,
right.
Big time. Yeah.
Which I think is so cool about it. I think it's cool that. Because I don't think music and like identity have always been close. Absolutely. But this is kind of a reimagining of that.
It's more proactive.
Yeah.
I feel like, and especially if you're into Shabaka Hutchings projects. That speaking of proactive, like we were talking about Angel Bat Daweed earlier, Shabaka, all of his stuff is very much proactive, and these are the social messages I'm trying to send.
It's not it's explicit.
It's absolutely explicit. I mean, I'm trying to. There's that one Sons of Kemet album that I think is...
The Queen is a Reptile?
No, not The Queen is a Reptile.
Okay.
There's... I'd have to look it up. But it actually says, like, Black Power in the album title. Like, it's very much in there.
It's the one after that, I think.
Yeah. And Comet is coming, too. A little more on the futurism side, but it's endemic. You know, this is part of the formula, the format change. And change implying that wasn't there before is wrong. I just mean that... the way it's being put forth in the music
is different than it ever has been.
I think so,
in a jazz space.
And capitalizing on, not in a taking advantage way, but in conjunction with the Black Power movement lately, Black Lives Matter, and I think just all the social change we've seen in the last 10, 15, 20 years, the ways in which it is being expressed have changed.
Interesting.
And it's really cool to see, and also powerful. Like it's really intense. Some of the Sons of Kemet stuff, Angel Bat Daweed stuff, it's intense listening.
Part of the reason that I was drawn to that Sons of Kemet album too, the Your Queen is a Reptile is the first one I heard. and I was like, wow, this is like seriously intense stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I gravitate toward the heavy music because of the intensity, in part, just because it's so, for me, like it's so compelling and it's so novel in that sense. But I found the same level of intensity with at least that album in particular.
Well, and I think that's why having this be in the jazz space is so interesting, because I'll say, based on my personal experience, I'm sure based on your personal experience too, like suburban white people, jazz was easy listening. Jazz was relaxed music.
Right.
Jazz was non-confrontational.
Right.
And it was never intended to be. Like Miles Davis was never non-confrontational, but that's how we took it, because by the time we grew up, the norms had changed enough that that music had been rolled into the general cultural narrative and didn't have the context that it came out in, right?
Well, in some ways, and sometimes, and in some ways, it was curated to us that way.
Sure.
Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Where I went to school, the jazz station was notorious for being overfunded and underutilized. It was basically the same group of rich white people who wanted to play the same jazz standards and stuff that they wanted to hear.
Well, and now we're getting back to the academic barriers to jazz programs too. It's like we've like white people have kind of stolen this music and gatekept it, and it's like, what is happening?
I mean, that was actively happening with that station, and everyone knew it, and everyone was trying to fight it, but it was like, you can't. We couldn't change it. But that's what I like about this too. Hearing about this is so like, it feels so intentional, so passionate, and
it'll make you uncomfortable, and it probably
and should. It should, and it just has the authority that it should have. Yeah, and that's what I like about it.
Well, and authority that no one needs to give it, because it's coming from this place of like pure expression.
Plus it fucking slaps. Like, well, we mentioned cutting edge, and like it really, like, for something to cut an edge these days is not easy.
You know, in the literal sense of the term.
I'm not saying like cutting edge, like,
no,
ideology. I'm saying the music itself is like musically cutting edge.
I think all these people are at the top of their game.
Exactly.
Too. Which is
and to
insane.
be doing something innovative in a world where we're inundated with novelty and innovation is saying something. And to have it have that level of emotional power.
Yep.
And coming from a place like Chicago that has such a storied history of systemic injustice, coming from a place like London that also has that, and specifically coming from that program, the Tomorrow's Warriors program, you can kind of see these narratives being built and these families being built. And so, you know, we have kind of the bridge there with Micaiah and Shabaka, but there's surrounding orbits and the artists there. You got Suito Kench, Theon Cross, all over there in the London scene too. Ezra Collective, which is literally a group of young, recent alumni from the Tomorrow Warriors program, have been touring internationally, played Lincoln Hall a few months ago.
Okay. I saw that pop. That name's familiar, so I saw that pop up on the show.
It's amazing what the power of this collective support can do. And what gets me, that I think is kind of just mind-blowing about all of this, is the fact that this is coming back into not a jazz headspace. It is coming back into I don't want to think of like indie heads, but you know, like the general music consumer population. And especially talking about a Kamasi Washington, to take it back to LA, we're talking pop and hip hop people. Like Kamasi played, I think, Lollapalooza. That's insane. When have you ever heard of a jazz artist playing Lollapalooza? But that's the kind of draw he has. He sold out the Riviera Theater once. Like I've seen him live a couple of times. It's phenomenal. But the fact that he's able to achieve that level of access with a general audience, bringing jazz back into the general cultural narrative, and not just like, oh, that's jazz, you know, like, oh, that's this thing.
It's lost its like academic, like, but it's not lost any of its like academic, like talent, or any of its like instrumental musicianship, right? Like,
well, and I think there's still the people who want to make it, you know, but it is going past, God, post-jazz. It is going past jazz to a place where people who had felt maybe marginalized by where jazz has gone recently, it's bringing them back. And then also on the Kamasi side of it, incorporating those elements that make it more musically digestible for people who have been alienated by the rigidity of trad jazz, you know.
When it speaks to their flexibility of saying, like, we understand the pulse, here's how we're going to sell this to these people. You know, that's all very intentional too, which is...
And the connections back to hip hop too, like, you know, getting Kendrick to guest on or getting Kamasi to guest on a Kendrick track.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, Terrace Martin Dinner Party. That is such a great collaboration. It's Terrace
Right.
Martin, Kamasi Washington, and someone else I'm blanking on. But they
And-
do like a combo of trip hop and jazz, and it is fantastic.
And not just being talented, but knowing like these people will elevate this for me or help me get it on the main stage.
Right,
while I
and
plays
they
it or
seek
whatever.
those elements out in their music. So like when they're, Kendrick, To Pimp a Butterfly is an amazing album, but like some of the guest sax tracks on there, like bringing in these more abstract elements that aren't just straight samples, not pulling samples from old funk tracks, but making his own samples with Kamasi is just, it's so cool to see. And bringing what I feel weird to even call jazz at this point to this wider audience is remarkable.
And that also calls back to like the power and value of collaboration versus competition within those circles.
And building those families.
They've all gotten farther from building these collectives together.
We get better music that way.
Yeah.
Better art, better outcomes.
And bringing your message to a wider audience too, because in some ways, so there's a very specific track I'm thinking of that is Kamasi. It's a Terrace Martin track. Kamasi guests on it. There's a couple of other guests. But it's called Pig Feet.
Okay.
And it was released right after 2020. All that went down with George Floyd. And there's a lot of graphic sound effects and stuff. But just having those jazz elements in there, I think, and this is to speak a little defamatorily about the general listening audience of hip hop, which is to say, not about the listening audience, people who won't listen to hip hop. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I feel like putting those elements in there brings people in who would normally be like, well, this is a hip hop track. I'm not going to listen to it. But bringing in the sax, bringing in the more melodic elements, it suddenly is like, oh, this is art now. Which I kind of hate.
You're kind of saying, we know, yeah.
It's unfair, but it's cool that they did that.
It's unfair, but I think it made people take the song more seriously.
Okay. Maybe if it was a learning moment, maybe there is some.
It made it more impactful.
Yeah.
Even though that's not fair.
Right. But I think there was a hearing of the power of that element in incorporating that and making it have people realize like, oh no, this is bigger than just we're dropping this track,
Yeah.
But I think that's also a big criticism of people who won't listen to hip hop. So
I mean that's a whole other
that's
episode.
a whole other kettle of fish. But
it never hurts just to listen to it.
No, it's that you want to talk about intense tracks. That is an extremely intense track. I'll put that on the playlist too. But it is, the reincorporation of I think these jazz elements to kind of wake people's brains up and putting them in unfamiliar juxtapositions sonically also speaks to the post
lends
element.
itself perfectly.
Yeah. And it brings in new audiences, and I think that's worth exploring for sure.
I do like specifically, I mean, referencing Sons of Kemet, but I guess without much more knowledge beyond that and just going off of what you were saying too, like, I think this music is like, I hope what happens here with jazz and whatever else is flowing into this happens in other spaces, right?
Yeah.
Like if you kind of blueprint this and kind of apply it somewhere else, like what would that look like, right? Like what could reimagined sort of like rock be like in this?
I was thinking like
does it exist already?
Indie rock, if that's still even a thing, absolutely needs that wake up call.
As you were talking, I kept thinking like bands like this are why people say rock is kind of dying.
Yeah.
Because this is a little bit more, you can't say more interesting or more compelling, but it sort of is. Like, it's fresher, it's newer.
It's more intentional.
Yeah,
it has more to say.
Yeah. It has more to say. Yeah, I think when you're thinking about indie rock, because I was trying to draw a parallel, and my only thought was, well, there's the big reincorporation of like electronic influences into that, but
honestly, I think it's still rock.
Vast majority of those bands don't have anything to say. They just want to be there and have a good time, and there's something for that. But if we're talking about a reinvigoration, I mean, coming into a musical exploration place with intentionality, with a sense of community, and I think that's a big part of it too, is just there's a very strong spirit of community and collaboration here, is going to naturally be more innovative than we're just doing this to fuck around,
And it always produces a better product. Like when rock has had moments like that, it's always been because like a bunch of people were in a similar area collaborating and making better music.
Mhm.
Like all the New York scene stuff, all the like stuff out of LA, like,
Yeah.
That's happened in the past
Yeah, like
10, 20
DFA
years.
was all just friends.
Yeah, I mean,
pretty much.
DFA, The Strokes,
Yeah.
all that stuff came out of the same crucible.
Well, and to kind of speak to the younger people side of this, Reservoir, that band I mentioned earlier, also international anthem, but this is very much a band that is a group of friends, and it's Will Miller, who was the brass person for Whitney, with Seema Cunningham, Macy Stewart from Phenom Ohm. This is like all Chicago indie scene people. Brandy Younger actually guested on this album. They've got all sorts of different collaborators from other labels. They're all about the same age, and they just put out this beautiful through composed album that's a bunch of people riffing off of each other, and to see it live was amazing. It's where you start to get the bleed over to Super Records, Sen Morimoto,
Okay.
who also plays saxophone, but he raps too, so he has like there's hip-hop crossover there.
So if you were to start to dive into this, start with the like Chicago, London scene, the older, like the older generation of people doing this, and then to cut even more of an edge, you're saying like the younger kids these days are like kind of doing
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how you're defining the edge, I suppose. I'd say a lot of
further removed from jazz.
That's true.
Okay.
It's also more accessible. I would say the
Interesting.
Reservoir stuff, it's more on the Kamasi side of the spectrum,
Okay.
where it's further removed from jazz, but it's taking the elements of jazz into a more universal space,
Interesting.
which I think is maybe even more interesting than just like really driving deep on the angle of jazz there. Kamasi's thing, I feel like, is the most pop version of this trend I'm describing, to a point where you can hear almost like Burt Bacharach level cinematic pop orchestral influences. Reservoir has a lot of that, but they're taking the instrumental, orchestral, collaborative technicality of the Makaya, of the Shabaka groups. That Kamasi is really, he has a lot of that, but he's very more focused on like a solo sound. This feels more collaborative, more group
It's
effort.
good that these intra-scene dynamics exist this early on.
Yeah.
It's good, yeah.
And it all feels just, there's a beautiful melodic harmony of it that feels ritualistic.
Yes.
When you listen to
And
it.
this is where, this is definitely jazz removal territory, but
Yeah.
it's like this overarching atmosphere or like almost pantomime to the whole album is like, especially when you compartmentalize at least all this music into album format, like these albums can tell a story through and through, like you said, not just collections of songs and riffs and kind of just...
It's cinematic.
Yeah, it's totally cinema.
Yeah.
And, oh man, this is why I love, like certain types of heavy metal do that. There's exactly the kind of same like cinematic application to other styles of music too. It's even in the heavy metal scene. And me personally, I'm drawn very much to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing about all of this is I don't know where the culmination is. I don't know. It's
That's the
still
exciting
going.
part.
I
That's the
know,
exciting
right?
part,
I'm like,
yeah.
it's gonna keep
This
building.
is why music is still exciting.
Yeah,
Will
and I
always
don't
be,
know where the road's gonna take us, but it's
Yeah.
gonna be a fascinating journey.
I think
The
it's
roads-
okay not to know.
The road's going to take us right into the comment section below.
Get in the
Wow.
comments.
And the description where we're going to link and obviously itemize some links for you, a playlist, blog
Oh,
post.
I
yeah.
already have such a long playlist. Don't
So,
even
Yeah,
worry.
check out the blog on
To
this
actually
one.
hear with your ears what we are talking about, of course.
It will certainly
Yeah.
help. I know we're throwing a lot of proper nouns and names at you and a lot of descriptive terms, but listen to the playlist. Tell us your thoughts. If you have a better name than post jazz for what we are talking about, please tell
have it,
us, because
yeah.
I don't want to call it post jazz.
Well, I was going to say, what do we have? Like top 3 here?
Oh boy.
I thought of a couple.
Okay, what you got?
Universal jazz. Transatlantia jazz.
These are actually not bad.
I don't know if they're right, but they're what I've
Universal
got.
might be too general. Transatlantic, maybe like a little
Transatlantic sounds mid-century
Yeah.
to me.
Also, isn't the old-timey like type of speech in the 50s
This is
movies?
I know I can't do it.
I can't do it either, but it's fast.
Transatlantic.
Yeah,
that's it,
transatlantic
that's it.
accent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah, the post-jazz, I think,
It's
is
a tough nut to
that's-
crack.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately like the way like it immediately brings your brain to it. But
Yeah, I want
it
to say
just
something
sounds-
with cinematic,
it just sounds
but
shitty.
yeah, it really does.
It sounds like something you don't want to listen to.
Post-punk ruined
Yeah.
post-hyphen anything. I can't do that
I
one
mean, I
anymore.
think whatever genre that it gets settled on will not be
Let's
super
call it
interesting.
after jazz.
That almost like
After
sounds
jazz.
better because it's more intense.
That's
kinda
cool, yeah.
After jazz.
Or like
Like one word.
dystopian, but it's not
That's
dystopian.
why
It's
I like-
utopian.
that's why I
It's
like
more
trip hop.
utopian.
That's a good one.
Trip hop is a good
Yeah.
one.
Anyway,
Well,
we're gonna
puzzle on it.
yeah. Anyway, like, comment, subscribe, whatever you need to do to say hey. We'll have everything for you in the description, and enjoy the comment section.
Yeah.
Cheers. It's been Jenna. We
Thanks
love
for
her.
hanging
Thank
out.
you. Thank you.
Woo!
Hey man, what you doing by myself? If I tell you what, boy, I say, hey man, what you doing by myself? It's natural. I say, hey man, what you doing?